to get started, I guess let's just introduce ourselves first. For anyone who we haven't met, I'm Alyssa. I do bold branding and web design for businesses and entrepreneurs, and I'm based in Asheville, North Carolina. Maddy.
Hi, I'm Maddy. I am a website copywriter. I am based in Canada, Ontario, Canada, if any of you are from Canada or familiar. And I'm super excited to be having this conversation today. Alyssa and I actually started bonding over this topic, this kind of shared frustration with this industry standard that talking about your clients and sharing about your clients online, especially in a negative light. And so we're excited to have this conversation today. We actually met at a water cooler type event hosted by one of our friends, Kate, every Monday. And so we really got to know each other there and bonding over our shared thoughts about client memes on social media. And so I'm excited to share those with you today and to have that conversation.
Yeah, awesome. So to get started, that's like going a little, lighthearted, have a little laugh, sort of like validate why we're all here, and look at some of the things that we probably can all relate to. So like Maddy said, we bonded over kind of seeing this type of content online. And let me share my screen. Okay, so first, that's just kind of like acknowledge that in this group of creatives, we're all creative business owners here. Like these are things we've all experienced. We can definitely all have a little chuckle at. Like I think, feel free to drop in the Q&A if you can relate to some of these things. Like trying to chase down a client, kind of maybe kicking yourself if you've like already sent the final files but you haven't gotten paid yet. I personally have experienced this with a client who was requesting design edits that really weren't in line with the goals of the project, and so I definitely this is exactly the face that was going on inside my head at that time. Pretty self-explanatory. I think we've all been here. And yeah, a lot of times as business owners, we might have a thought in our head that really wouldn't be appropriate to say to the client. So relatable. And then this is another meme that's kind of been circulating a lot recently, that again, very relatable. A lot of times clients who don't have a design background have a really hard time articulating what they want, if they even really know what they want. And that's something that we sometimes struggle to come to an agreement on. So that's definitely share that in our related experiences here. And we wanted to start with that and really validate the way everyone's feeling. But the reason that we wanted to host this is because we see a lot of this type of stuff being shared in Instagram stories and social media posts, newsletters, by both new and experienced designers alike. And we want to kind of offer a different perspective on this. So we kind of want to backtrack a little bit and consider the client's perspective. Yeah. Do you want to?
Yeah. So for example, imagine your doctor or your lawyer or someone who waited on you at a restaurant or a plumber. Imagine they posted about a situation like this that involved you on social media. I would love to hear in the chat how this would make you feel if, this kind of content was directed at you or someone you were considering hiring. This kind of content, although it's really funny and, it's really funny to other designers or other creative professionals, it can make our audience and our clients feel really distrustful or wary of working with us or even other service providers. I know that exactly. It's happened to me with a business coach who was awful, had this happen. I had someone, I'm sharing this with permission, but I had someone recently who messaged me on Instagram after I shared some content about this webinar. And they let me know that they stopped going to an esthetician because the esthetician that they were going to see had started posting content about clients and the terrible things that they were doing. I didn't get any light into what those things were, but just shaming clients. And so the person who messaged me actually stopped going to see that esthetician because of the experience that they had had with their content online. So we just want to make sure that no one wants to feel bad when they're working with you. They're coming to you to solve a problem, whether that's getting their website designed or getting their social media beautiful. They're not coming to you to be shamed and feel terrible, or feel terrible for knowing less than you. And it also sets a bad example for newer creatives who are joining the field, whether you're a designer or a copywriter, as I am. They're going to start anticipating bad situations and learning to automatically think of your clients as problematic or as, less than.
Yeah, that's such a good explanation. And I also want to add that we don't want to shame anyone who's here. If you have personally shared something like this, that's not the point of this conversation. As we covered, we can all relate to these things. So don't feel bad if you have done that. We just want to kind of take a look at how we can shift our mindset and start to kind of help educate clients in a way that helps projects go smoother and helps educate them and really does help them understand our work better, instead of making them feel afraid to reach out and afraid to ask questions. So one, I guess, way to start getting into that is just to look at the difference between red flags and clients simply not knowing how our work goes. There's definitely a lot of conversation online about things to look out for, and red flags are very, very real. There are definitely some things that you're gonna want to run in the other way from, and it's also okay to be firm on policies and boundaries and remind your clients of those things. But we also have to remember that our clients are not designers or copywriters or marketers or whatever our work is. They don't do our work. So a lot of times they don't know what the process looks like, and they may not have ever worked with somebody like you before. And so sometimes the questions that they ask might initially set off an alarm, but they just need a simple explanation, and you can go from there, and it might be a great project. So a few things that I think are seen as red flags, but could be a case of the client simply not knowing, would be, for example, if the client expresses that your price is too high. So this can be a red flag. It could turn into a red flag, but if that's an initial response, that's not a straight up no. They could just be expressing surprise or trying to learn more about the value that they're going to get, try and justify it for themselves. And in some cases, they may genuinely not be able to afford that. And that doesn't mean that they don't value you. It's just if they can't afford something that they can't afford. Where it becomes a red flag is more so when they are continuously asking for lower prices without expecting less work alongside that, or wanting things done without acknowledging the work and the process that goes into it. So there's definitely a distinction there. Let's see. Do you want to mention the next couple?
Yeah. So another thing that we view as room for client education, something that clients don't necessarily know, not necessarily a red flag, is if a client is asking you to do things a certain way or why you include certain things, if they could have some exception to your policy, they're probably not trying to undermine you in your processes unless you've explained it a million times. it's likely something that they just don't know or didn't understand before. And another thing that I see a lot of times online, I actually just saw content about this yesterday, ironically, is clients who have had a bad experience with another creative. Definitely seeing content about if someone says they've had a bad experience with another website designer or a bad experience with a few website designers, I think oftentimes a lot of people present that as a red flag, but I think it doesn't necessarily have to be a red flag, or it could not be a red flag, right? It could be more so about the style of designers or creatives that they've worked with. It's hard for clients to know what to look for in a creative, right? As creatives, it's a big part of our role to look at the client and to think about if it's truly the best fit for us. So those are definitely some of the things where there can be education and boundary setting, which we will talk about shortly. And then the red flags that we genuinely want to encourage you to look out for, because this presentation would not be complete without mentioning them. We definitely don't want to paint it in the light that everything can be addressed with just saying, we can just educate and boundary set. There are some times where things are red flags. So let's get into those. And I would love for you to drop in the chat if you have any red flags that you are very confident that are always red flags, or if there's things that you want some feedback on from other people. So the first one is continuously crossing or disrespecting your boundaries after you've clearly communicated them multiple times. If they're refusing to pay you the amount that you've communicated, like if they've accepted the project, they've signed a contract, they're not paying you, or if they're paying you all the time, yep, withholding payment, yep, paying late for no reason, with no communication, trying to get a discount after they've, already signed the contract and said what they're going to pay you. If they're trash talking past contractors, we talked about this kind of in the last section, but if they are specifically saying that, all contractors are terrible, no one can do their jobs, all of that kind of stuff, that's just going to make everyone feel bad, then it's a little bit of a red flag. And then the last one is just kind of a flippant attitude about your work, and just being really clear from the start that they don't value you and they don't value the work that you're providing. So if they're saying things like, I know how long this should take, or I can get this cheaper on Fiverr, or, they just kind of want you to handle everything and have no insight. Or if they have, I have a brother who could do this website design, I don't need you to do this for me, that kind of thing. Those can definitely be red flags, and I would be remiss if we didn't encourage you to look at those and think twice about them.
Yeah. And I would add that a client who is like a visionary is not necessarily a bad fit, because sometimes it gets kind of painted that like a client who is a creative is not a good fit because they will try to art direct, and like that can be true. But I have a lot of clients who are they're just visionaries. They're very creative. They picture things in their heads. They have ideas of what they want, but they're still very, very good collaborators because they're trusting me as an expert. So there's definitely a difference between the person who's like, I used to work in marketing, so I know how this works, and the person who's just fun and has a lot of ideas. So yeah, the distinction between red flags, I think, is a little bit more gray than it's sometimes made out to be. Like a lot of times it requires asking more questions and a little bit more conversation. And yeah, so I guess now that we have kind of covered some of the red flags and differences there, we can sort of move into what steps we can take to help create better experiences for clients and avoid any red flag situations from getting worse. And again, like it can definitely, we do want to validate that like it can be really frustrating to communicate things over and over again. And especially when something seems like so obvious to us, it can seem sometimes like the client is trying to undermine you by asking questions or not understanding or not getting it. And also setting boundaries can be difficult too, because sometimes like you want to put your foot down, but you don't want to be rude, and that things get out of hand. And you know, that I feel like that could be a whole different conversation about that. But one boundary setting tip, if you have a client that is consistently kind of emailing you and trying to push policies, or, you know, expecting responses in a really, really short turnaround, you can definitely just kindly like remind them of things that you've already said. Like, you don't have to ignore them. You don't have to give them like a curt response. You can even like put in your email signature, like, you might hear back from me in 1 to 2 business days. I like to respond to things like that by just starting with something like, thanks for asking, before I get into like, here's the part you're not gonna like, basically, just to answer it so it doesn't sound like I'm annoyed, and it sort of like lightens the more serious answer if I have to address like a difficult question. So that can be helpful. And then another huge tip is to just be as transparent as possible about your process and policies and communications and everything upfront, as early as you can, like during your consult call, in your proposal, in your welcome packet, in your contract, you know, in meetings with the client. You really can't say these things too often, because the sooner that the client knows about how you work, then it prevents like a sticky situation later on from, you know, popping out of the blue. And also, if a question does arise, you'll have so many previous communications to fall back on where you've already stated that thing, versus seeming like, you know, making the client feel like they're blindsided with new information. So some examples of that could be like using your social media to answer common questions or talk about your process and how you work, using blog posts to do like long form answers to misconceptions in your industry. That's really helpful, not only for general education, but if you get a question from a client that you've answered, you can send them a link instead of having to just write a whole drawn out response and try to figure out that wording. And then Maddy, you had that really good point about thinking about like you and the client against the problem.
Yeah, so this is actually something that I use in copywriting, and lots of copywriters use in copywriting. And it's this idea of it's you and your client or your audience versus the problem. I think so often in these situations when we're trying to communicate with clients and there's these tough situations, we're thinking of the client as the problem. And don't get me wrong, sometimes the client is the problem, but it can really help to shift that mindset a little bit to think of, okay, there's the client, there's me, and there's this problem. So for example, you know, the client is sending you too many emails and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm getting so many emails from this client, right? Been there, I get it. But maybe the issue is actually everyone gets a lot of emails and it's part of being a business owner. So part of looking at that through the lens of like me and my client versus the problem is that you're getting too many emails, and maybe the solution that you can communicate with your client is, hey, you know, my inbox gets really full sometimes. I'm asking my clients to, you know, practice putting as many things in one email as they can, or, you know, communicating it to me X way. So really setting out those clear boundaries. And another example of, you know, you plus your client facing the problem is when you have clients who ask you, you know, dumb questions, or you just feel like they're being lazy. I've heard both of those things before. When truly the problem is that the client doesn't understand. They don't have the expertise that you do. That's why they're hiring you. So instead, we can look at it as, okay, there's me, there's my client, and we need to fight the problem. The problem is that there's not enough information for the client to understand. So how can we work together to get them this solution and to figure out what they don't know? And how can we explain it in the best way possible? And really, one of our biggest suggestions to be able to kind of share those pet peeves, if you will, with people in the industry, or if you're sharing online, if that's something that you really feel called to, instead of focusing on the specific client, focus on that overarching issue, right? It's not the problem that one client is sending you all of those emails. Maybe it's, everyone gets a lot of emails, and being a business owner sucks because you get a lot of emails, or that, client education is hard. Those are things, and those are ways that you can really take that pressure off of that client relationship, and instead kind of project that problem somewhere else, so that you don't feel like you're mad necessarily at the client. You're going to work together to solve the problem, right? So that's kind of how I view that. Someone said no email back. Yes, definitely feel free to set those boundaries. If someone is not communicating with you in a way that, they shouldn't be communicated with you, especially if it's in your contract, it's in your onboarding, everywhere, it is absolutely okay to say what Alyssa said, which is like, thanks for asking, or thanks for that email. As a quick reminder, as per policy, whatever, please make sure you submit everything here. It's okay to remind clients of things. I know it's frustrating sometimes, but again, the overarching problem is that things are frustrating or confusing sometimes for clients, and we're going to help them solve that problem by clearly communicating with them.
Yeah. I think a lot of it comes down to like having empathy for the client, and just remembering, like, just trying to put yourself in their shoes, and like remembering what it's like to hire a contractor for something that you don't know anything about. I'm even thinking about like when we bought our house, like I know I asked a lot of stupid questions to the realtor, but if he had made me feel like an idiot, then we would have fired him. And same, like I'm like one of those people who, when something is wrong with me, like medically, I go down a rabbit hole and Google everything. So I've definitely like asked my doctor some ridiculous things. But if my doctor ever if I ever saw them posting on Instagram, like, venting about how many stupid questions they get, I would be like, oh my God, like, tell me how you really feel.
Yeah, or even like in public somewhere, right? Like say you saw them at like the coffee shop or something like that, and they're standing in line and they're telling someone else about something that I said that was really embarrassing. I'm going to crawl in a hole. I'm going to leave there. I'm not going to get a lot today.
Yeah. And so it's just kind of like remembering that, like, the same way that your doctor has way more medical education than you do, like, your clients don't have a background in the service that you provide. And that's most likely why they're asking. It's not because they're trying to be rude. And also, like, a lot of us go into business for ourselves because we don't want to answer to somebody else. Like, you don't want to have a boss. We like having the freedom and the autonomy and being able to set our own rules and all that. And all that is so true. And like the client is not your boss. You do have autonomy, but there is still the necessity to sort of like leave your ego at the door a little bit. And sometimes as a business owner, you do have to do a little bit of hand holding and over explaining, and just know not to take things personally. And when a client asks for something, it's not anything against like you and your abilities as a creative. It's just, something that they most likely just don't understand because they've never done it before.
Mm-hmm. And another part of that, something that I've thought about recently and have experienced recently with clients, is that oftentimes a lot of clients are potentially working with a few different providers. So for example, if they've hired a website designer and they've hired a copywriter and potentially a graphic designer, and maybe they have a marketing team or a social media manager, there are all of these people that they're connected to that they are having to follow different processes for each person. So say you're a social media manager and you really like using Trello, which I've seen a few people mention in the chat. But your client, for you, for example, if you're a copywriter, maybe they're submitting things through your Honeybook or your Debsado. So the processes are completely different, and it just might be confusing. So it's important to remember that everyone's process is different. Clients might get confused, might think that they have to do things for someone that they're not supposed to be doing. So it's absolutely okay to set those boundaries and to have that empathy at the same time, and just remind them respectfully. You could even, if it feels good for you and it's something that would make it feel easier for you, you could always create a canned email in your Gmail or your Dubsado or your Honeybook that just starts with like, thanks for asking, or like, thanks for your email. As a reminder, please, and then like insert whatever they actually need to be doing. And then you can just say like, if you have any questions, feel free to send me another email, or we can book a follow-up call, or refer to this proposal that I sent you, or the onboarding, or this part of my website. That makes it a little bit easier to send those emails, because I know sometimes it's tough when you're frustrated and you're just like, I don't want to send you the link again. But you know what? That's a real situation that has happened with clients. But yeah, that always helps me just, address the problem and help the client as quickly as possible, while also kind of taking the emotional aspect out of it.
Yeah. I have a whole huge like Notion page full of response templates, and like every time I have to respond to a new situation, I'm like, I better save this in case it happens again. So yeah, it's really helpful to just like have that bank to pull from. So, and I think it even like makes it less like annoying and less stressful, because you're just like, oh, copy paste, instead of having to like be like, oh, how do I respond to this?
Someone suggested in the chat, I think this was Trey, about having, a few people suggested about a virtual happy hour, virtual network of friends. Alyssa, I think we should put together a virtual happy hour for everyone.
Great. We definitely should. And Rebecca, I just wanted to acknowledge that I saw your question and I saved it for the end, so we will answer that. But yeah, I guess like on the topic of responding to situations that frustrate you, we have some suggestions for things that might like help turn these into more enjoyable situations. And I think like first and foremost is to just not respond immediately. Like if you're getting an email that sets you off, whether it's like a request for bad edits, or a content delay, or whatever it may be, just don't answer it right away. Just like step away, take some deep breaths, go for a walk. I think every time that I have immediately responded, I have regretted something that I've said. A lot of times I'll like draft an email and then not send it, and then I'll come back to it the next day and I'll be like, yeah, this is way too harsh, because you're just too in the moment. So that's really helpful, as well as thinking about like how could it be more of like an educational moment for the client instead of like a slap on the wrist. Like how can you just explain why you're asking for whatever you're asking, or why the answer is whatever it is. And this is definitely like a case-by-case basis. I think there are some times where you don't want to over explain and you just need to give a simple answer, but depending on the situation, it can really help them to understand like where you're coming from. And also having someone proofread your emails is very helpful. My mom has read a lot of my before I send them, just to get a second opinion, because like as a solopreneur, you're very in your own head, and sometimes having somebody else tell you like how something comes across is really helpful. And yeah, like I said before, sometimes starting responses with something that's like, thanks for asking, or like, happy to help clarify this, is like a nice way to just come across like kind and respectful, and then like break into the more serious information that you have to say. And if I'm referring to something that's already been established in prior conversations, personally, I don't like per my last email, because I think it just sounds a little snarky. So I'll just say like, as I mentioned on this date, or like as was outlined in our contract. And I think it's okay to remind them of things that were already said, but just be conscious of like the way that you're saying it. And yeah, and I think maybe like the biggest tip is to like note every time something sticky arises, especially if it happens over and over again, and look at, is this something that could be addressed either on your website or in your contract or somewhere in your process to make it smoother or prevent it from happening in the future? Is there anything that you could like turn into a bigger educational resource, like a blog post? Is there a clause that needs to be added to your contract? So again, like not always blaming the client, more so like the client is bringing things to light that that you can adjust to make everything much more enjoyable for both parties in the future. And then, yeah, also I would just note that like even with all of this, like this isn't going to ensure that everyone who works with you again is always going to know everything. Like you're still going to need to do the educating. You're still going to need to direct people to links and blog posts and all that. But it definitely makes it easier.
Yeah, educating is a huge part of being a business owner, whether you think it is or not. But it's actually kind of fun when it's good education and it feels good. But we put together a few ideas. Actually, the chat has been full of ideas about how to vent safely, which has been really awesome to see. So definitely take note of those as well. How to vent safely, where to do it, if we're not posting memes or posting about our clients, how can we vent safely? Because as you know, you can't just store all the stuff inside or you might explode. We're all humans, so you have to chat about it somehow. I would love to hear in the chat, if you haven't already shared, where you typically go to talk about client situations. We typically enjoy connecting with a creative business partner or friend who is either in the same industry as you or just kind of gets the situations that you're in, or in creative only groups. So at the beginning, we talked a little bit about the water cooler chat that Alyssa and I are both part of. And that is such a great way to not only vent about those situations, but also to get really helpful perspectives and responses. As Alyssa talked about a few minutes ago, it's really easy to see something or to get an email from a client and think like, oh my gosh, like they're attacking me, they hate me, like everything's wrong, and respond based off of that. But sometimes it can be even more helpful to have someone else's perspective on it, even if it's just for them to listen to you talk for a moment. It feels really great to be able to have those people to listen to. And lastly, there's a few other people that we would recommend. You could talk to, if you have a business coach or a mentor, you could talk about that with them. If you have a therapist or a counselor, that's also a great space. And kind of outside of your business / like everyone you know is kind of in your business. So like your partner or your best friend or your family member probably know either enough about your business to understand the situation and to understand your frustration. But those are all really great spaces to go. And I can't wait to keep reading the chat and to learn a little bit more about your favorite spaces to go. But yeah, those are all really great, safe places to vent offline that aren't going to harm your clients or potentially ruin your reputation. I will also say, final note on this part is that if you are going to complain about client situations and if you're sharing specific details, probably don't do that, number one. But if you are going to do it, probably don't do it over like a messaging app or like Instagram or somewhere where someone could either hack your account or screenshot it and then potentially share it with other people. You just never know. You never know. So always err on the side of caution if you are able to, and just protect yourself in that way.
Yeah, that's a good tip. Yeah, so that was great. That was great, Maddy. Good tips and advice. So moving into Q&A, we did have a couple questions ahead of time that we can answer. And if anyone has any other questions, feel free to drop them. And I think you have the ability to ask anonymously here if you would prefer. So totally up to you. But anything, like literally anything about like responding to specific situations or broad questions that we're happy to answer. So here are a few that we got ahead of time. One was, how can we respond well when a client is upset with results that are a direct result of their own decisions? In other words, putting the blame on us for the outcome rather than taking responsibility. Do you want to answer first?
I feel like my answer is I feel like your answer is a little bit more focused on like the procedures, but mine is very focused on feelings because I'm just a very empathetic feeling person. Feelings are a really big thing for me, but I would say that it's hard to look at the bigger picture sometimes. And I think we've all had situations where we've blamed someone else instead of taking accountability. because taking responsibility and admitting that we're wrong, especially as a client or as a service provider, it's hard, right? It's hard to say I'm wrong. If you've ever had an argument with someone, you know that it is hard to say I'm wrong. And so ideally, throughout your process, there should be some communication explaining, if you've made a recommendation to your client, explaining why your client should choose X decision over Y decision. So for example, I don't know, if you're a website designer, I feel like that's where all my examples go to for some reason. If you're a website designer and you recommended that your client has this sort of logo instead of that sort of logo, and you explain the strategy behind it, you can take a note of any time that there has been a decision made that was advised against. If you have them in emails, even better, but just so that you can reference those when responding, and you can do it politely and do it nicely and just say, hey, remember that time that I suggested you do this, and this is why we did it, and going from there. And then something I learned in customer service when I used to work in customer service for a few years was just asking the client or the customer, what is the ideal outcome you're looking for in this situation? Like, what is the best thing that could happen coming out of the situation when you're responding to someone who's upset, and figuring out what you can do to get them there. Maybe they are looking for you to make a slight adjustment to their logo, but it's not in your agreement, your contract. But what can you do so that you're both happy and you can get them there and finish out your contract without both of you feeling kind of gross?
Yeah. I also would say that I sort of like breezed through this a little bit earlier, but I think that addressing this type of situation is a lot easier when there has already been a lot of clear communication, and like you said, like explaining why up until this point. So if for example, like a client is upset because they didn't follow a policy, like they didn't get their content in on time or something like that. If you have had that in your contract and you mentioned it on the sales call and you put it in the proposal and you put it in the welcome packet and you had these 8 check-in emails leading up to this point, then it's really hard for the client to say that they didn't see this coming. So the clear communication is so key. And I do think that that's something that develops, like the more and more that you have these situations, you're like, okay, I got to get that into the communication for next time. And then like these things will happen less and less. But I would say, as far as like how to like literally answer something like this, I think it's good to validate them. Like you said, like no one wants to say I'm wrong. And it's not great, like customer service, to like be pointing fingers either. So I would say something like, I understand that you might feel this way, like that's never my intention for you to feel whatever, like I never want a project to go this way, like kind of validate how they're feeling. And then just acknowledge, like you said, Maddy, like, however, in previous emails over the last month, I told you this thing, or, as it was outlined in the contract and the welcome packet and whatever the situation is. And then as far as like you acknowledge like what outcome do they want? Say they want like a full refund or something like that you're like, hell no. That really comes down to like what you're comfortable with, and like it's up to you if you want to offer like a partial refund to keep the peace or something like that. But there's also nothing wrong with saying like, unfortunately, I'm not able to do that because of the work that I've already done, or like because of the projects that are scheduled next, or whatever the situation is, and just like leave it at there. I think that's another situation where you don't have to like over explain. Mm-hmm. And it's really up to you, like how much you want to give in when it comes to like saving the relationship. So yeah.
Yeah, if you've already been clear and you have a contract that says no refunds, or no like refunds after a certain point or whatever, like as Alyssa said, like you're covered. It's basically up to you to decide how you want to end the work with your client, if you want to finish it out, or what you're going to do with it. So it's really up to you. But yeah, as long as you've got your contract in place and those communications, you'll be good.
Yeah. Okay, we had another question that was submitted that said, I will be selling art made by artists in my family. I'm an introvert and I hate answering the phone. Hashtag relate. I realize this is a different type of business than yours, but I'm wondering if you use a digital platform to conduct back and forth of offers, negotiations, and also have you centralized a place where client communications with you are housed and kept for records?
Mm-hmm.
So I would say like a lot of this is your choice. Like if you don't want to pick up the phone and you're able in your business model is able to function well through just written communications, like that's fine. I think it really depends on what is necessary for your business model and also like your own ability to like provide a good customer service. I will say that as a fellow introvert, talking on the phone does get easier the more you do it. But personally, I also hate receiving cold calls, and I have taken my phone number off of the internet everywhere because I would prefer everything to be funneled through my inquiry form and emails, and then we schedule a call. I do not like getting calls out of the blue that are inquiries because it just throws me off. I need to prepare. I personally do think verbal communication is important if the relationship aspect is really important. So that's, I think, where it comes down to the individual business and what is important in your business and into your audience. So for me, like having that personal connection is really important. So phone conversations need to be a part of it at some point for me. And my process with that is, again, just like inquiry comes in and then we set up a consult call, and I kind of have like a general script of questions. So I feel like I have something to follow instead of just like totally going in cold. And as far as record keeping, that is really important. I keep everything to email myself. And if anything ever comes in from a current client through like Facebook or Instagram or text, I just redirect them to email. I don't answer anything. I don't answer anything through anything else. So yeah, what about you, Maddy?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I'm also not a person who shares their phone number with clients or with people who are inquiring because I don't want to call. I will Zoom call with you, but a phone call is a no-go out of the blue. So I use Honeybook. Some people use Dubsado or a different CRM, and that's where I keep all of my client communication. Or through email. It's kind of easy if you have a CRM. Typically, most of them will integrate with your email anyways. So you'll have all of your messages in one place. And it's definitely a lot easier to be able to kind of see what has been said and what's been agreed upon, especially with the communication pieces that we've touched on. But yeah, Alyssa, I agree completely with you.
Awesome. Okay, if anyone has any other questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. And I have Rebecca's question here from earlier too, which was, sometimes I want to post about a client experience purely to spread awareness about my industry, but I don't want that person to feel called out. Do you think it's worth posting, or should I wait a while to post about it so they don't feel it is associated with their experience? It's a really good question.
Yeah, I would say I would reflect on, like, number one, how general can you make the content about it? Like, for example, going back to the email thing about a client sending you too many emails versus like I'm getting too many emails. Obviously, that's not specific to a client situation typically, but how like general can you make that, right? And how can you make that a problem that you're facing, not necessarily because of a client, and turn that into an education piece? I don't think the emails was the best example to give there, but yeah, just how general can you go with it and without providing any details of like the client's specific situation? Because yeah, I feel like if I saw that as like a client, I'd be like, oh, that's not great. But yeah, how general can you be? How can you focus on making it educational instead of like making it about the specific client experience? Those would be my points. But Alyssa, I would love to hear what you think about that.
I agree. And I think it depends on the situation. Like if it's just like a innocent question, I think it's okay to be like, here's a question I get a lot and here's the answer. But if it's like something that's really caused stress in the project, I might wait a little longer. And I would also, regardless of when you answer it, I would also just not answer it in a bitter way. Like definitely kind of be like, I can understand why some clients think this, but here's the reality. You know, not be like, oh, I'm so angry that this keeps happening, you know. And also recently I had a similar situation where I wanted to share like an experience that I was having with the design community, because I have a separate Instagram account that's directed to designers for education around running a design business. And it was, I mean, I again was not being bitter or rude or anything about the situation, but I also didn't really want the client to see it. So I just blocked the client on that specific account and shared through my stories, knowing that if somehow they still saw it, I wasn't sharing anything rude. I was expressing like understanding where they're coming from. And it was also really geared towards like, this specific situation was geared towards like, hey, designers, here's how you could address a situation like this. So I don't know if that's necessarily like the best solution for everything, but I agree with just like your sense of like being general and just being like kind about the way you answer it.
Yeah, and just like, yeah, I think Alyssa, you touched on a really great point about like when you shared that on your account, like you weren't trying to be like bitter or snarky. Like I think kind of something that we touched on a little bit earlier was like that cooling off period. Because I do think it's helpful to share about those like experiences sometimes in an educational way. Going off of what we talked about earlier about like sharing content that answers those big questions. So yeah, answering it like as generally as you can. And yeah, really taking the emotion out of it, not projecting based off of that like situation, if that makes sense. So like not projecting your like bitterness or your like upsetness or like, I had a client one time who was the worst and they did this. I know you would never do that. But yeah, just like taking that emotional part out of it and focusing on the educational part of it. And taking that cooling off period, you know, sometimes we need a little bit of time to think about it and reflect about how something will come off. And I think it's also okay. You are always welcome. Anyone is always welcome to send content to me and be like, how does this come off? I'm always happy to review it because I think it's fun. But yeah, seriously, like just feel free to ask someone if they like how they would reflect on it if they were a client of yours or a past client of yours.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Well, I don't see any other questions, but if anyone drops any in the next couple minutes, we can definitely answer them. But I guess in the meantime, we can, thank everybody for coming. Really appreciate your thoughts in the chat. I see a lot of great comments about having a scotch, and some days where I'm like, I need a glass of wine now. But yeah, it's been great chatting about this, and I hope you all maybe got some tips or insights. We will send the replay after as well. And also want to share where you can find Maddy and I, as well as a resource for you to continue to help with addressing sticky situations. So here is Maddy. I don't know if you have anything you want to share with yourself.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much, everyone, for coming. This was honestly such a great conversation, and seeing all your Q&As in the chat and all of your suggestions was honestly really great. This is a conversation and a discussion that Alyssa and I have been having for so long, and it's very validating to hear that there are so many other service providers who, are committed to really changing this narrative and want to work on it. So thank you so much for being here. And I seriously think that we should put together a virtual happy hour because I think that would be so much freaking fun.
Yeah, that would be really fun. Yeah,
Stay tuned, everyone.